Right. Diving into something pretty interesting today, folks.
Yeah.
We got this document, Fight Cancer with a Ketogenic Diet.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of our listeners probably have heard of the ketogenic diet.
For sure.
Maybe tried it, maybe not.
Yep.
But this goes pretty deep into, some pretty core ideas about how this diet might play a role in managing health.
Especially with cancer.
Yeah. Yeah, particularly in the context of cancer. So
Right.
that's kind of our focus today. And we want to make sure that we extract like the really key insights from this document.
Absolutely.
Because it's pretty dense. It's not just like a quick pamphlet.
No, it's very comprehensive.
This is for someone who wants to know the why, wants to know the how.
Yeah, they're looking for that deep understanding.
Right, exactly. And that's kind of our mission here, right?
Totally.
We're not just going to skim the surface.
Now we're going deep.
We're going to really unpack the underlying principles and how this stuff's actually applied.
Exactly. And this document really gives us a lot to work with.
Yeah, it does.
It covers so much, the science behind it, the potential benefits, even some recipes and tips for getting started.
So, it's practical, too.
Absolutely. It's about making this applicable to everyday life.
Cool. So where should we even begin with something this broad?
Well, I think one of the most kind of game-changing ideas in here is about the metabolic basis of cancer.
Okay, yeah.
It's like, forget about just genes for a second.
Right.
This document really pushes the idea that how cancer cells make energy.
How they fuel themselves.
Exactly. That's like a fundamental issue.
So it's almost like cancer as a metabolic disease, not just a genetic one.
Exactly. And that's a big shift from how we've traditionally thought about cancer.
Yeah.
Like we always hear about oncogenes and mutations and all that.
Right.
But this document, it's heavily influenced by the work of Dr. Thomas Seyfried. And he argues that the core dysfunction is really in how these cells make energy, how they metabolize.
Interesting. So it's less about the blueprint, more about how the machine's actually running.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Okay, so if we're talking about energy, how do regular cells get their fuel compared to cancer cells? What's the difference?
So normal cells, they're super adaptable.
Okay.
They've got these little powerhouses inside them called mitochondria.
Right, the mitochondria.
And inside those mitochondria, they can create energy through this process called cellular respiration.
Okay.
And the cool thing is they can use both glucose, which comes from carbs, and fats to do this.
Oh, so they have options.
Yeah, they've got flexibility, right? They can switch between these different fuel sources to make ATP, which is basically the energy currency of the cell.
So normal cells can use glucose or fat, no problem.
Pretty much.
What about cancer cells? Are they as flexible?
That's where things get interesting.
Okay.
This document highlights a real vulnerability of cancer cells.
Okay.
They seem to be primed to run mainly on glucose.
So they have a favorite.
Yeah, they really love it. They use it super efficiently for that rapid growth and division that we see in cancer.
That makes sense, given what they want to grow fast.
Right, but that also creates a situation where if we can limit their glucose supply, that could be a real way to target them.
Kind of starve the engine that's driving their growth.
Exactly, that's the idea.
Okay, so that makes sense. But then how does that translate to what we eat? How do fats, carbs, proteins, how do those things actually affect this whole glucose supply for these cells?
Yeah, so the document, it breaks down the impact of different macronutrients on blood glucose and insulin levels.
Okay, so the macros.
Yeah, and it's really clear that dietary fats have a minimal impact on those levels.
Interesting. So fats don't really spike your glucose?
No, not really.
What about protein?
Protein causes a bit of a rise, but it's modest compared to carbs.
Ah, okay, so carbs are the real culprit here.
Pretty much, yeah. Whether it's simple sugars or those complex starches in grains and fruits, and even some veggies.
Yeah, even some veggies can have more carbs than you think.
Right, those carbs cause a big spike in your blood glucose.
And that triggers insulin, right?
Exactly. Your pancreas releases insulin to help shuttle that glucose into your cells.
Okay, so insulin, we usually think of it in terms of blood sugar control, but what's its role in this whole cancer context?
That's where things get a little more complex.
Right.
High levels of insulin, which often come from a diet high in carbs, can actually have effects that might even promote cancer growth.
What? Really?
Yeah, it can mess with your body's ability to burn fat for fuel.
So it's like insulin saying, use this glucose first, and the fat just sits there.
Kind of, and it can also affect different growth pathways in the body.
Okay, and I guess that's where this whole nutritional ketosis thing comes in, right?
Right. Nutritional ketosis is the metabolic state that the ketogenic diet is aiming for.
So let's break that down. How does it actually work, and why is that a good thing? potentially, in this situation?
So when we cut back on carbs drastically,
Like really cut back.
yeah, like way back, our body's glucose reserves start to get depleted. And as a result, the body adapts. It's like it goes into survival mode and starts breaking down fats for energy instead.
Makes sense. Got to get fuel from somewhere.
Right. And when it does that, it produces these compounds called ketone bodies.
Ketones, yeah. We hear about those a lot with keto.
And these ketones, they can actually be used as fuel by a lot of our normal cells, including the brain.
Oh, so the brain can run on ketones too.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Huh. So it's not just glucose, it's ketones too.
Exactly.
And is there something about ketones being like better fuel, or is it just that we're taking away the glucose that cancer likes?
Well, it's a bit of both, actually.
Oh,
There's
wow.
research suggesting that when normal cells use ketones, they might actually experience less oxidative damage compared to when they're using glucose.
Oh, wow. So it's not just about starving the cancer cells. It might actually be helping the healthy cells too.
Yeah, potentially creating a healthier environment overall.
Interesting. So let me get this straight. The core strategy here is to lower blood glucose and insulin through restricting those carbs.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we want to bump up those ketone bodies.
Exactly.
And that combo, that's what makes it harder for the cancer to thrive.
That's the idea. It makes the metabolic environment less hospitable to those cancer cells.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. And it's kind of funny, the document even mentions how, like, doctors use glucose to find
Well,
cancer.
oh, yeah, with PT scans, right?
Yeah, they inject a glucose-based compound, and the cancer cells just light up because they're sucking it all up.
It's ironic, isn't it? It sort of highlights their dependence on glucose.
It's like, here's your kryptonite so we can see you better.
Exactly.
Okay, so this whole idea of targeting cancer's metabolism, is there actual research backing that up?
Oh, yeah. The document cites a bunch of studies.
Okay.
They suggest that a ketogenic diet could potentially do things like destabilize tumor DNA, reduce tumor size, lower levels of insulin and IGF-1, which is another growth factor,
Okay.
and reduce overall inflammation in the body.
So it's not just theoretical, there's some actual evidence emerging.
Exactly. And Dr. Seyfried's work, his book and papers go into all this in much more detail.
We'll definitely link those in the show notes.
Yeah, for those who really want to dive into the science.
This whole ketogenic diet thing, it's not exactly new, is it? I remember reading that it's been used for epilepsy for a long time.
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
The document highlights that ketogenic diets have been used for almost a century to manage pediatric epilepsy.
Wow, a century.
Yeah, and often with a lot of success, even in cases where drugs and surgery haven't worked.
So it's not like some fringe, untested idea.
No, not at all. And it usually has fewer side effects than those traditional pharmaceutical treatments.
Interesting.
And the document also references a study by Dr. Niebling on children with brain cancer,
Oh.
which suggests that it might have potential in oncology too.
So there's a history of therapeutic use, at least for epilepsy.
Exactly, which lends some weight to its potential in other areas.
So this is all sounding pretty good. But shifting to a ketogenic diet, especially when dealing with something as serious as cancer, feels like a big step.
Absolutely.
Are there any, like, absolute no-goes, medical conditions where this approach just shouldn't be considered at all?
Yes, and the document is very clear about this.
Okay, good.
There are several medical conditions where a ketogenic diet is contraindicated.
Meaning, like, absolutely do not do this.
Right, it could be really dangerous.
Okay.
These include certain genetic disorders that affect how the body processes fats.
Okay.
Things like carnitine deficiencies, beta oxidation defects, pyruvate carboxylase deficiency, and porphyria.
Those all sound pretty serious.
They are,
Oh,
and
yeah.
they disrupt the very metabolic pathways that the ketogenic diet relies on.
So it's like trying to run a car without wheels.
Pretty much.
And are those usually diagnosed early on?
Many of them are picked up through newborn screening, but porphyria can actually develop later in life.
Okay, good to know.
So if you have any concerns, definitely talk to your doctor.
Right. Always talk to your doctor.
Always, often.
Okay, so besides those specific metabolic disorders, are there other health issues where someone should be extra cautious and, maybe talk to their doctor before jumping into this?
Yeah, the document provides a list of those too.
Okay.
It includes things like a history of pancreatitis, active gallbladder disease, any condition that affects liver function or how well you digest fats, poor nutritional status overall.
So if someone's already malnourished, that's not a good time to start.
Right. It also mentions gastric bypass surgery, abdominal tumors, decreased GI motility, and a history of kidney failure.
Okay, so lots of things to consider.
Definitely, the ketogenic diet can cause some pretty significant metabolic changes.
Right, and those changes could potentially worsen these conditions or interfere with their management.
Exactly.
Okay, what about medications? Are there specific drugs that could interact badly with a ketogenic diet?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Some medications need really careful consideration, and you should talk to your doctor before even thinking about starting a ketogenic diet if you're on these.
So, like, what kind of medications are we talking about?
Well, for example, some anti-seizure medications like Zonegrin, Topamax, and Diamax, those can increase the risk of something called metabolic acidosis.
Which is not good.
Not good. And that risk could be even higher if you're in ketosis.
So the ketogenic diet could exacerbate that.
Potentially, yeah. And diuretics like Lasix also need to be monitored closely because the ketogenic diet itself can act like a diuretic.
Well, that makes sense. You don't want to get dehydrated or mess up your electrolytes.
Exactly.
So communication with your doctor is key here.
Absolutely. The document really stresses that.
Okay, so what about people who are already going through cancer treatments, like chemo or radiation? How does the ketogenic diet fit in with those?
That's a really important question.
Yeah,
Chemotherapy and radiation can really affect the body in a lot of ways.
right. The immune system, liver, kidneys.
Exactly.
So those all need to be considered when planning a ketogenic diet alongside those conventional treatments.
Absolutely. And the document recommends finding healthcare professionals who really understand ketogenic diets in the context of cancer.
So someone who's not just going to say, oh, that's a fad diet.
Right. Someone who gets it. And Appendix B in the document actually lists some resources for finding those kinds of practitioners.
Oh, that's helpful.
Yeah, and it's also worth remembering that chemo and radiation often come with their own side effects.
Right. Fatigue, nausea, all that.
Exactly, and those might overlap with or even be made worse by the initial adjustment to a ketogenic diet.
So you've got to be really careful and have good medical supervision.
Definitely, especially in those situations.
All right, so it's clear that this isn't something to just try on your own, especially with existing health issues or ongoing medical treatments.
No, definitely not.
But let's say someone has had all those conversations and it seems like a viable option for them.
Okay.
What are the main goals they should be aiming for, and how do they track their progress?
So the document emphasizes two main goals. The first is to achieve and maintain nutritional ketosis.
Which we talked about earlier, right? Lowering glucose, raising ketones.
Exactly. It's that combination that's thought to be most beneficial.
So it's not enough to just lower glucose. You got to have those ketones up too.
Right. And as ketone levels rise, the brain and other tissues can adapt to using them for fuel,
Okay.
which also helps prevent your blood sugar from getting dangerously low.
Which can be a problem, right? Especially when you're cutting carbs.
Yeah, hypoglycemia can be a real issue.
And that's where that metabolic flexibility comes in, right?
Exactly. The body learns to switch between fuel sources efficiently.
Okay, so that's goal number one. What's the second?
The second is to manage any side effects that come up as your body adapts to the diet.
Makes sense. We talked about a bunch of those earlier.
Yeah, and that might involve things like taking electrolyte supplements or adjusting medications, but always under the guidance of a healthcare professional, of course.
Right, always. So how does someone actually know if they're hitting that first goal, that lower glucose, higher ketones thing? Are there ways to measure that objectively?
Yes, definitely.
Good.
The document introduces something called the GK index.
GK index. Okay, what's that?
It's basically a ratio of your blood glucose level to your blood ketone level.
So it's like a snapshot of where you are metabolically.
Exactly. And the calculation is pretty simple.
Okay.
You take your blood glucose reading in millimoles per liter,
Okay.
and you divide that by your blood ketone reading, also in millimoles per liter.
For those of us in the U.S. who use milligrams per deciliter, is there a way to convert?
Yeah, you just divide your glucose reading in milligrams per deciliter by 18,
Okay.
and then you can use that number to calculate the ratio.
Got it. And what's a good GK index to be aiming for?
Dr. Seyfried's research suggests that a GK index of 1.0 or below is a good indicator of therapeutic ketosis.
So that's kind of the target zone.
Yeah, that's where you want to be.
Okay, and the document also mentioned a study by Dr. Eugene Fine
Yes.
that suggested that higher ketone levels were linked to a greater reduction in cancer growth.
Right, so the higher the ketones, the better, potentially.
Interesting.
But of course, this is all still research, and more studies are needed.
Right, of course. So besides this GK index, are there other ways to monitor progress, like Regular blood tests.
Yeah, general lab tests can definitely be helpful,
Okay.
but the document specifically mentions the hemoglobin A1C test.
Okay, the A1C.
Right, that test gives you an idea of your average blood sugar levels over the past 3 months.
Right.
But it also includes a cautionary note.
Oh.
Miriam Kalamian, who's a well-known ketogenic diet expert,
Okay.
she points out that some conditions common in cancer patients,
Like what?
things like recent surgery, rapid red blood cell turnover, anemia,
Okay.
even high-dose vitamin C infusions, those can skew the A1C results.
Oh, so you could get a misleading reading.
Exactly. So it's really important to have those results interpreted by a doctor who understands those factors.
Makes sense. Someone who knows what they're looking at.
Right.
Okay, so for monitoring things day to day at home, what tools does the document recommend?
They recommend using personal glucose and ketone meters.
Okay, so you can check your levels yourself.
Yeah, and they specifically mention the Precision Extra Meter by Abbott Laboratories.
Okay, good to have a specific recommendation.
Yeah, and for people with visual impairments, they recommend the Prodigy Voice Meter.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, it talks to you.
That's great for accessibility.
Right, but they do mention that ketone testing strips can be more expensive than glucose strips.
Oh, that's something to consider.
Yeah, it's an ongoing cost.
So how often should someone be checking their glucose and ketones?
For blood glucose, they recommend checking first thing in the morning before breakfast and then about 2 hours after lunch and dinner.
Okay, so kind of like a diabetic would.
Yeah, pretty similar.
What about ketones?
For ketones, they advise more frequent checks when you're first starting the diet.
Just to make sure you're actually getting into ketosis.
Exactly. And they explain that urine ketone strips, like the Bayer Keto Sticks, can be used in the beginning for the first couple of weeks,
Okay.
but they become less accurate over time.
Ooh, why is that?
Because as your body adapts, it starts producing a different type of ketone.
Interesting.
So after that initial period, it's better to use a blood ketone meter or get lab tests.
Okay, so the urine strips are just for getting started.
Pretty much.
That makes sense.
And they also mention that glucose and ketone levels tend to be lower in the morning and higher in the evening.
Huh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's just a natural fluctuation.
So keeping track of all those readings and what you're eating, that sounds pretty important for understanding what's working and what's not.
Absolutely crucial.
Okay.
The document strongly recommends keeping a detailed log of your food, supplements, and blood glucose and ketone readings.
Kind of like a food journal, but with extra data.
Exactly.
And why is that so important?
Because it helps you see how different food choices are affecting your metabolic markers.
So you can start to see patterns.
Right? Like, oh, when I eat this, my glucose spikes, or when I eat that, my ketones go up.
Okay.
And it's also super helpful information to share with your healthcare team if you run into any problems or unexpected side effects.
So they can help you troubleshoot.
Exactly. And the document suggests using simple spreadsheets, good old-fashioned notebooks, or even online tracking tools.
Oh yeah, there are tons of apps for that now.
Right. There's even a food log on the Wisconsin Diabetes Prevention website that you can use.
We'll link that in the show notes too.
Perfect.
Okay, so we've covered the basic science, things to watch out for beforehand, and how to track progress.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's get into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah.
How does someone actually start eating a ketogenic diet? What are the key things to know about the food groups?
All right, so the document dives deep into this,
Right.
and it starts by emphasizing that fat is going to be your main source of calories on this diet.
Okay, so fat is not the enemy here.
Not at all, it's your friend.
All right, so how much fat are we talking about?
It gives a breakdown of different types of fats.
Okay.
Triglycerides, saturated, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated.
Very close.
And it basically says that saturated and monounsaturated fats, which you find in things like butter, macadamia nuts, coconut oil, olive oil, avocado, egg yolks,
Okay.
those are generally well tolerated and more stable chemically.
Okay.
It suggests limiting polyunsaturated vegetable oils that are high in omega-6 fatty acids.
Okay, so not all fats are created equal.
Exactly.
And I noticed that coconut oil and MCT oil were highlighted as particularly useful. Why is that?
So coconut oil is interesting because it's got a high proportion of medium-chain triglycerides, or MCTs.
Okay.
And these MCTs, they're metabolized really quickly by the liver and turned into ketones.
Ah, so they're like a fast track to ketosis.
Exactly. And MCT oil is even more concentrated, so it can be especially helpful when you're first starting out.
To kickstart things.
Yeah, but the document does warn about starting slow with both of these.
Okay.
Because too much too soon can cause some stomach upset.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So ease into it.
Got it. What about dairy? You know, it's got fat, but also protein and lactose, the milk sugar.
Right, so the document explains that dairy fats like butter, sour cream, heavy cream, cream cheese.
Okay.
Those are actually pretty low in casein, which is a milk protein, and lactose.
So they don't spike your glucose as much.
Right, and it suggests including them in moderation.
Okay.
Dr. D'Agostino even gives a guideline of limiting dairy calories to about 20 to 30% of your total intake.
Oh, interesting. So it's not a free-for-all.
No, not at all.
Okay.
And it also mentions that some people going through chemo might have temporary lactose and fructose intolerance.
Oh, wow. So that's something to watch out for.
Yeah, it's a note from Patricia Daly, another ketogenic diet expert.
Okay. And what about the whole hormone thing with dairy? Some people are concerned about that.
Right, the document addresses that too.
Okay.
It basically says that the amounts of hormones in dairy are tiny compared to what your body produces naturally.
So it's not a significant source.
Right, and they're likely broken down during digestion anyway.
Okay. So not too much to worry about there.
Not really.
What about protein? That's a big part of any diet.
Yeah, and on a ketogenic diet, it's all about balance.
So how much protein are we talking about?
Enough to maintain lean muscle mass, but not so much that it kicks you out of ketosis.
Okay. Walk me through that.
So protein comes from things like meat, fish, poultry, eggs.
Right. The usual suspects.
Exactly. But if you eat way more protein than your body needs, the excess can actually be converted into glucose.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's called gluconeogenesis.
Gluconeogenesis. That sounds complicated.
It's basically your body making glucose from non-carb sources.
And that's bad because we're trying to lower glucose, right?
Exactly. It defeats the purpose of the ketogenic diet.
So enough protein to keep your muscles happy, but not a protein overload.
That's the sweet spot.
Okay. And the document also specifically mentioned glutamine in relation to protein.
Yeah, glutamine is an amino acid, a building block of protein.
Okay.
And it's important for overall health. But some research suggests that cancer cells can use it for fuel, too.
Oh, says it's not good.
Right, so again, it's about balance, not completely avoiding protein, but not going overboard either.
And are there certain foods that are especially high in glutamine that we should be aware of?
The document specifically advises against L-glutamine supplements.
Okay, so no extra glutamine.
Right, and it also suggests avoiding concentrated sources of glutamate, which comes from glutamine.
Okay, like what?
Things like whey protein, MSG, hydrolyzed vegetable protein, soy protein isolates, and even the artificial sweetener aspartame.
Wow, so many hidden sources of glutamate.
Yeah, it's worth paying attention to food labels.
Okay, so we've talked about fats, protein. Now let's talk about the real star of the show, or I guess the villain, carbohydrates.
Right, carbs are the ones that need the most drastic reduction on this diet.
So what are the key things to know about cutting carbs?
So carbohydrates, that includes sugars and starches.
All right.
Those are the main target for
You
reduction.
got to slash them.
Pretty much, and the document lists a ton of different names for hidden sugars and starches in processed foods.
Oh, so it's not just like looking for sugar on the label.
No, there are all these sneaky names they use.
That's tricky.
Yeah, so you really have to read labels carefully.
Become a label detective.
Exactly, and it also points out that lots of foods we think of as healthy, like fruits and some vegetables, can be surprisingly high in carbs.
Yeah, I've been caught up by that before.
It's easy to do.
So even if it's natural sugar, it still counts.
Right, it all adds up.
And green leafy vegetables, those are the lowest in carbs, right?
Yeah, generally, but they still have some carbs, so you got to factor them in.
Okay, and the document also talked about the difference between total carbs and net carbs.
Right. Net carbs are what you get when you subtract the fiber from the total carbs.
Okay, so fiber doesn't count.
Not really, not in the same way.
And why is that?
Because fiber doesn't get digested and absorbed like other carbs.
Okay, so net carbs are the ones that really matter for ketosis.
Exactly, and the document mentions that for some people, they might be able to increase their carb limit a bit over time as their bodies adapt.
Okay, so it's not necessarily a forever thing, those super low carbs.
It might not be, but the initial phase definitely requires strict restriction.
Okay, so start strict and then maybe loosen up a bit later.
Potentially, yeah. But it's all about individual response and working with your healthcare team.
Right, and speaking of fiber, what's the deal with that on a ketogenic diet? I know it's important for digestion, but if we're cutting carbs.
Yeah, fiber intake does tend to be lower on this diet because you're cutting out a lot of the high fiber foods like grains and some fruits.
Okay, what's the problem with that?
Well, constipation can be a common side effect.
Oh, right, that makes sense.
Yeah, and the document also really stresses the importance of drinking enough water.
Especially when you're changing your diet like this.
Exactly, hydration is key.
Okay, and I also saw that the document talked about fasting and intermittent fasting.
Yes, it mentions them as potential strategies to use alongside the ketogenic diet.
Okay, so what's the rationale there? Why would you want to fast on top of already restricting your food?
The idea is that fasting can help lower insulin levels even further,
Okay,
and it can really push your body to rely on fat for fuel, so it deepens ketosis.
makes sense. You're kind of forcing your body's hand.
Right. But it also notes that there might be some differences between men and women in how they respond to prolonged fasting.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Some studies suggest that women might experience more metabolic stress from fasting.
Huh. So it's not one size fits all.
Definitely not, and it gives a bunch of tips for people who are considering fasting.
Like what?
Things like staying hydrated, keeping busy to distract yourself from hunger, monitoring your glucose and ketones.
Makes sense. You want to be prepared.
Yeah, and it also suggests gradually reducing caffeine and sugar intake before you start a fast.
Oh, that's a good idea. I'd probably be a headache monster otherwise.
Probably, and the author actually shares their own experience with a 3-day fast.
Oh.
Yeah, they said hunger was manageable, but the first and last days were the toughest.
I can imagine breaking the fast is probably tempting.
Yeah, and they mentioned some minor side effects like headache and dizziness.
Okay, so not a walk in the park, but manageable with the right approach.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the basic dietary shifts. Now let's go back to those potential side effects.
Okay.
The document goes into a lot of detail about how to manage them, so let's break it down.
Yeah.
First up, hypoglycemia, low blood sugar.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of ironic on a diet that's all about lowering blood sugar.
Right, but it can happen, especially in the beginning when your body's adjusting.
So what's going on there?